My name is Aaron Keaton, and on the morning of October 12th, I drove into the Cascade Mountains thinking a rented cabin and a day of silence would finally untangle my nerves. I'd been grinding through 12-hour days at the firm, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, and stress had been gnawing at the edges of my focus. A coworker suggested I take a quick getaway. Just go somewhere quiet, she said. Go breathe for once. So I booked a small wooden cabin near a trail spur called Copperline Bend, tucked off a service road that barely showed up on Google Maps. It was cheap, available the same day, and promised true solitude. Maybe I should have taken that line more seriously. The drive took longer than expected. The roads in the Cascades have a way of stretching themselves when you're not paying attention. The tree line seemed to fold inward the higher I went, like the forest was swallowing the sky. It was close to 3 p.m. by the time I reached the last gravel turnoff. A hand-painted sign pointed ahead. Cabin 6, turn left. The arrow looked freshly repainted, the white still bright against the weathered wood, but everything around it felt older than it should. The moss too thick, the air too still. When I finally parked beside the cabin, I stepped out into absolute quiet. No wind, no rustling, not even the distant drone of insects. Just the crisp mountain air and the unnatural stillness of a place that didn't seem used to people. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from thick cedar logs with a stone chimney that leaned slightly to one side. The front porch sagged just a bit, like it hadn't been stepped on in years. My booking confirmed that the key would be waiting in a lockbox attached to the railing. Sure enough, there it was, and next to it, wedged beneath a smooth river stone, sat a folded piece of paper. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a welcome note, instructions for the heater, a liability waiver, something boring. But the second I picked it up, I knew that wasn't what this was. The handwriting was tight and deliberate, like every letter had been shaped with caution. At the top of the page, underlined twice, were the words, "Rules for Cabin 6, read before entering." My chest tightened a little. Even so, I unfolded the paper fully. After unlocking the door, lock it again from the inside before you take a single step into the cabin. Do not open any curtains, blinds, or windows at any time. If you hear knocking between sunset and sunrise, do not respond. Do not look directly at anything you see through the gaps in the wood walls. If you wake up and something is standing in the kitchen, leave it alone. It will not enter any other room if it is ignored. Check under the bed only once, before nightfall. Not after. If you hear your name whispered, it is not for you. Do not answer. Leave before 10 a.m. tomorrow. No exceptions. I read the list twice, then a third time. The rules weren't written like they were part of a marketing gimmick or some quirky cabin lore. They were written the way someone writes instructions for handling a dangerous chemical, blunt, unembellished, almost clinical. And the last line at the bottom chilled me more than all the others combined. Failure to follow any rule voids our responsibility for your safety. I stood there longer than I probably should have, just staring at the page while the forest breathed around me. I waited to hear a bird, or a crack of branches or something, anything, to remind me that the world was still normal. But nothing came. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was some strange local humor. Maybe guests kept leaving windows open, raccoons got in, and the owners finally leaned into the theme. Maybe the knocking was just branches hitting the siding. Maybe the thing in the kitchen was a bear. But the rules didn't read like jokes. They read like warnings. Still, I'd paid for the place, and it was only one night. I wasn't about to let a creepy sheet of paper ruin the only day off I'd had in months. So I knelt down, punched the lockbox code, and freed the old brass key from inside. The door groaned when I unlocked it. The air inside smelled like cedar, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old tools. I remembered rule number 1 and immediately slid the lock shut behind me the moment I stepped in. Maybe I did it out of caution. Maybe I just didn't want to tempt fate. Small superstitions stick when you're alone in the woods. The cabin interior was simple. A twin bed pushed against the windowless back wall, a narrow kitchen counter with a propane stove, a small bathroom with a composting toilet, and a wood stove that looked like it had decades of stories baked into its iron surface. The air was cold, but not unpleasant. I set my backpack on the chair beside the table, exhaled, and tried to shake off the unease still pressing against the back of my neck. Outside, the sun was already lowering behind the ridge. I didn't have long before sunset. Rule number 6 played through my mind like a whisper I couldn't shake. Check under the bed only once before nightfall, not after. It sounded stupid to even think about, but the instructions felt too pointed to ignore. So before I unpacked, before I even took off my shoes, I walked to the bed, crouched down, and lifted the blanket edge just enough to see underneath. Nothing. Bare wood floor. Dust. A lost penny. The kind of emptiness you expect in an unused cabin. But when I stood up, I felt something shift in the atmosphere. Not a noise. More like a pressure change, like the cabin inhaled when I wasn't looking. I turned slowly. The curtains were closed. The windows were dark. The forest outside was silent. The sun dipped lower, and the first shadow stretched across the wooden floorboards. And somewhere just behind the walls, faint and deliberate, something touched the siding. Not knocking, not yet, just testing. The first sound against the siding was soft enough that I convinced myself I imagined it. A shift in cooling would, maybe, the temperature dropping as the mountains swallowed the last of the sun. That's all it was, or that's what I kept telling myself as I stepped back from the bed and let the blanket fall back into place. The room dimmed quickly, like someone outside was dialing down the light. The cabin didn't have electricity, so the only illumination came from the sinking daylight slipping thinly through gaps in the log walls. I didn't want to break rule number 2 by pulling open any curtains to check the time, but I knew I needed light before full darkness settled. So I dug into my backpack for the small battery lantern I'd packed. As soon as I switched it on, the corners of the room softened into view. The warm glow made everything feel a little less claustrophobic, though the shadows it cast weren't any easier to ignore. The logs were old, hand-cut, with uneven spacing between them. Nothing big could fit there, obviously, but the list of rules didn't say anything about big things. A second sound brushed against the back wall. A slow, dragging motion. That one I didn't imagine. I froze. My breath tightened, and even the air in my throat felt cold. I waited for another sound, but the forest resettled into that uncanny quiet I'd noticed earlier. The kind where every instinct tells you the silence isn't natural. The rules clicked through my mind again, one by one, until rule number 4 surfaced like a warning light. Do not look directly at anything you see through the gaps in the wood walls. I took a step away from the wall anyway. Maybe it was reflex. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was that familiar tug of curiosity that humans seem unable to kill, even when survival begs them to. I tried to distract myself by setting up dinner. Something simple from my pack. A silver pouch of dehydrated stew and a bottle of water for boiling. The propane stove flicked to life with a hollow whoosh. The warm hiss filled the cabin with a steadier noise. Something grounded. Something real. I let myself breathe again. The stew began to bubble when the knocking started. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. Came in 3 soft taps, polite, even, like someone who didn't want to appear threatening. But the quiet outside was so absolute that the sound cut through the cabin like a blade. I stared at the door. My hand tightened around the spoon I was holding. There were no footsteps outside, no crunch of leaves, no shift of weight on old wood. Just the 3 taps. Do not respond. Rule number 3. Not respond meant not respond. So I didn't move. I didn't even swallow. I stood there holding my breath until the spoon trembled slightly between my fingers. Another 3 taps followed, slower this time. Still no footsteps. My skin prickled as a thought slithered in. Something had reached the door without making a single sound. The stew hissed softly beside me. The propane flame flickered as if the air shifted. Eventually, the knocking stopped. Silence returned, swallowing everything. I went back to stirring the food with hands that didn't feel like mine. When I finally sat down at the small table with the steaming bowl, I kept my back to the door. I didn't feel watched exactly, but I felt observed, like someone was trying to memorize the rhythm of my breathing, the scrape of my spoon, the exact places my gaze landed. When I finished eating, I checked my phone, not expecting service. I didn't have any bars, but the time read 6:28 p.m. Sunset in the Cascades would hit around 6:40 this time of year. Full darkness would come fast. I needed to prepare the wood stove while there was still a sliver of light left. The logs stacked beside it were old but dry. I set kindling inside, struck a match, and coaxed a small flame into existence. The fire crackled, warming the space bit by bit. Shadows danced more comfortably now, less like shapes waiting to sharpen. For a few minutes it felt normal, almost peaceful, until something shifted in the kitchen. It was subtle, the smallest scrape, like a foot repositioning on old boards. I looked up sharply, lantern light shaking in my hand. Nothing stood there. The kitchen was exactly as it should be. Dark counter, water bottle, extinguished stove. The scrape came again, slow and deliberate. A chill seeped into my bones as rule number 5 resurfaced. If you wake up and something is standing in the kitchen, leave it alone. It will not enter any other room if it is ignored. But I wasn't asleep. I wasn't dreaming. I was wide awake. The room pressed tight around me. My pulse thudded too loudly in my ears. I tried to convince myself the noise was the cabin settling, but the scrape had rhythm, intention, and it was closer now, just beyond the small table, behind the counter's edge. Without realizing it, I held my breath again. The lantern flickered. The fire cracked. The scrape stopped. I stayed absolutely still, every nerve screaming for me not to look toward the kitchen. If the rules applied now, if they meant ever, not just after waking, then acknowledging anything in that space could be a mistake I couldn't undo. My back throbbed with tension. My jaw clenched so tight it ached. Minutes passed. Eventually, the sound faded. The air loosened. The cabin seemed to exhale once again. I checked the time. 7:03 p.m. Night had fully taken the ridge. A faint wind picked up for the first time since I arrived. And through the gaps in the wood walls, just for a heartbeat, I saw something pale pass between the trees. Too tall, too smooth, too silent. Rule number 4 whispered through me. Do not look directly at anything you see through the gaps. But I already had. For a long, thin moment I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stood there facing the center of the cabin, lantern trembling in my hand, knowing I'd made a mistake. The kind of mistake the rules warned me about in plain, unembellished words. Whatever passed through that gap, I'd looked, directly, fully, and the worst part wasn't what I saw, but what I didn't. There hadn't been any features. No face, no hair, no shape I could name. The pale thing slipping past the wall didn't match anything I've ever seen in the woods, and not because it was bizarre, but because it was empty, like the outline of something that hadn't decided what to be yet. My throat tightened. I slowly lowered myself onto the bed, lantern on the floor beside me, back pressed against the wall I trusted least. The warmth from the stove stretched only halfway across the room, leaving the far corners steeped in shadows that swayed with every pop of burning wood. I tried to steady my breathing, but every inhale felt too loud. The cabin creaked. Just wood settling, I told myself. Just old lumber cooling. But then I heard it. A whisper of movement brushing over the exterior wall. Circling. Not footsteps. Not dragging. Something lighter. Something feeling its way along the boards as if mapping the shape of the structure from memory. My skin crawled. I stood again, grabbing the lantern with shaky fingers and forcing myself to breathe through my nose. Panic would make me do something stupid, like open a curtain or answer a sound or look again when I shouldn't. I reread the rules in my head. All of them. I didn't know which one mattered now, but I clung to them because they were the only thing that felt like guidance in a place that clearly didn't follow normal rules of nature. The scraping outside slowed, then ceased altogether. Good, I thought. Then it called my name. Soft. So soft I almost believed it came from inside my skull. A breath more than a voice. Aaron. I felt everything inside me lock. The spoon I'd left on the table quivered. My heartbeat slammed into my ribs like it was trying to break out. Aaron. Not a voice I knew. Not one I recognized. Not even one that had the shape of a person behind it. The rules stabbed through me like a needle. If you hear your name whispered, do not answer. It is not for you. My instincts screamed to yell back, to tell whoever, whatever it was to stop. But I kept my mouth shut, jaw clenched, shoulders locked in place, eyes fixed on the opposite wall. The voice continued in that thin, hovering falter. Aaron. Longer. Closer. Then silence again. The lantern buzzed faintly. The fire cracked. My breath returned in shaky, uneven bursts. After several minutes, I forced myself to move around the cabin, checking every inch of the interior without breaking any rules. The windows stayed covered, the door stayed locked, and I made sure never to glance toward the gaps again. I watched the clock on my phone tick to 8:19 p.m. The hours were going to drag tonight. I already knew it. When the voice didn't return, I tried distracting myself. I cleaned the tiny counter. I reorganized my pack. I double-checked the lock on the door. I paced the narrow floor until the boards beneath me warmed with repetition. But the quiet outside wasn't normal. Not calm. Not peaceful. It had that heavy, listening quality again. Like everything in the forest was waiting for me to slip. When the fire dimmed, I fed it new wood. When my lantern buzzed too loud, I tapped it gently. When my stomach tightened in hunger, I ignored it. It was maybe 9:30 when the temperature dropped suddenly. Not gradually, but sharply, like a vacuum opened on the other side of the walls and sucked the warmth out through the cracks. I zipped my jacket up and knelt beside the stove to add more logs. That's when I heard the sound again. Not outside this time. Not brushing the walls. Something had shifted inside the cabin. Something in the kitchen. The exact place I'd refused to look earlier. Slow. Deliberate. A subtle scrape of weight shifting. My heart died in my chest before starting again in panic. Rule number 5 pulsed behind my eyes. If you wake up and something is standing in the kitchen, leave it alone. It will not enter any other room if it is ignored. But I wasn't waking up. I wasn't dreaming. I hadn't slept at all. And whatever was in the kitchen, it was definitely not ignoring me. My breath trembled as I crouched near the stove, trying not to make a sound. The lantern dimmed a little, its weak yellow glow flickering across the floorboards. I kept my gaze glued to the wood grain under my knees. Don't look. Don't look. Don't look. Something moved again, the slightest nudge of weight, like someone leaning forward, putting pressure on the boards. Then the faint sound of fingers brushing the counter. My throat tightened until it hurt. The fire crackled softly, and the heat from the stove whispered across my face, but I felt cold. So cold I thought my bones might start vibrating. Every instinct screamed to turn around, but the rules were sharp in my mind, slicing through the fear. It will not enter any other room if it is ignored. So I ignored it. Every breath took effort. A minute passed. 2, 5. The thing shifted again, one slow step back from the counter. Then another. Then a third, lighter, like it was drifting rather than walking. Then nothing. The air loosened. My lungs finally let me inhale without shaking. I didn't move for a long time. I didn't dare. I stayed crouched behind the stove until the room warmed slightly, until my breathing steadied, until the sound of the wind outside felt real again. But when I finally gathered the courage to sit back onto the bed, clutching the lantern tight, the silence of the cabin didn't comfort me at all, because woven into that quiet was one unmistakable realization. Whatever had been in the kitchen wasn't gone. It was waiting, on the other side of the wall, breathing in the dark, just listening. I sat on the edge of the bed, lantern clutched tight enough that the plastic creaked under my fingers. The warmth from the stove didn't reach this far, and the cold that bled through the walls felt sharper now, like whatever was outside had pressed its presence into the wood itself. The silence had weight, heavy enough that I could feel it in the space behind my teeth. My phone read 10:11 p.m. It would be a long time before morning came, and the rules didn't offer any reassurance about what to do until then. The only things I knew for sure were what not to do, and that list was getting harder to follow by the minute. A soft thud sounded just outside the cabin, near the back wall. Not a knock this time, not scraping. Something heavier, but not heavy enough to be a bear, or a deer, or anything that should have been capable of approaching without making noise before. I stiffened, holding my breath again without meaning to. A second thud followed, closer to the center, then a third, near the head of the bed, each one spaced apart like footsteps. Small, careful, deliberate. I forced my gaze away from the wooden gaps lining the walls. Even the smallest glance could be another mistake. My heart slammed so hard I felt it in my throat. Then everything stopped. Silence settled like dust. I waited, barely breathing. My mind kept replaying the pale shape I'd glimpsed earlier, the contour that had no contour, the form that didn't deserve the word shape at all. I wondered if it remembered I'd looked at it. I wondered if that was why it was pacing the cabin now, testing the walls the way you might run your hand along the bars of a cage, trying to find a weakness. I didn't want to lie down, didn't want to turn my back to anything, but my legs trembled with exhaustion, nerves stretched too tight. I sat back until my shoulders touched the cool wooden wall. Lantern settled on the bed beside me. The fire in the stove popped once, loudly, and that tiny bit of normal noise cracked the tension for a moment. That's when the whisper came again. Aaron. But this time it didn't come from outside. It came from under the bed. The hiss of my breath caught in my throat so sharply I almost choked. I jerked my knees up reflexively, dragging my feet away from the edge of the mattress. The lantern's glow trembled violently, shadows shuddering along the walls. The whisper rose again, faint but unmistakably beneath me. Aaron, higher pitched than before, hungrier, closer. Rule number 7 hit my mind with the force of a punch. If you hear your name whispered, it is not for you. Do not answer. I clamped my teeth shut so hard that my jaw ached. Aaron. The voice stuttered, as if trying out the syllables, adjusting them. My Aaron. My skin went cold. That wasn't just a whisper. It was learning. I grabbed the blanket and pulled my legs up fully onto the bed, curling against the wall like the cabin itself could shield me. I didn't dare look down. I didn't need to. I could feel that something was under the frame, inches below my spine, murmuring my name like it was discovering what a human was supposed to sound like. The whispering stopped as abruptly as it began. The silence that followed was worse. I held my breath until my lungs burned. My thoughts scattered into a dozen instincts that all screamed contradictory warnings. Run, stay, hide, move, freeze, none of them useful. Minutes ticked by on my phone screen. 10:27, 10:34, 10:41. Nothing moved, nothing whispered, nothing scraped. The world outside pressed quiet against the cabin, and the shadows inside finally stopped trembling. I considered climbing off the bed to grab more wood for the stove. The fire was starting to shrink again, but the idea of letting my feet drop near the floor made my stomach twist. Rule number 6 replayed in my mind. Check under the bed only once, before nightfall, not after. And now I understood why. Not knowing was bad, but knowing might be worse. The fire dimmed further, shadows swallowing the far end of the room. Lantern light alone wasn't enough. The cold seeped deeper, reaching bone level, the kind of chill that made my body shiver uncontrollably. I couldn't stay like this all night. I needed more heat. Finally, after a long battle with my own fear, I swung my legs over the bed, careful to keep them tucked in, toes not touching the floor, and slid off the mattress backwards so I landed on my knees instead of stepping down. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I froze. Nothing stirred under the bed. No whisper. No scrape. I crawled the short distance to the stove, keeping low, keeping my eyes away from the kitchen doorway, away from the gaps in the walls, away from the bed. I fed 2 more logs into the firebox and shut the iron door quietly, wincing at the metal click. The fire caught quickly, orange spreading warmth through the small space again. I stayed crouched, muscles trembling, waiting for the next sign that something wasn't right. But the only sound was the wind outside. A real, natural wind this time. A soft whistle through the distant treetops that sounded nothing like the earlier silence. I hadn't realized how badly I needed that reassurance until I heard it. Then a new sound crept into the room. Not knocking, not whispering, not footsteps. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing. Right behind me. My body locked. Every nerve screamed. Heat from the stove washed over my face, while an icy breath skimmed the skin at the back of my neck. I didn't turn. I didn't look. I didn't move, because I knew, with a certainty that hit like instinct, that what was behind me wasn't under the bed anymore. And whatever shape it had taken now, it was upright, standing, waiting for me to make the wrong kind of mistake. The breath behind me wasn't human. I didn't need to turn around to know that. It was too slow, too controlled, too aware of itself. Each inhale held for just a fraction too long. Each exhale thin and deliberate, like it was matching my breathing on purpose, except it wasn't getting the rhythm right. It was studying me, trying me on. I stayed kneeling in front of the stove, palms pressed to the warm iron, every muscle locked. The heat licked my face, but the cold at my back felt almost physical, like a dark presence leaning in. Don't turn around. Don't look. Don't look. The rules didn't say anything about what to do if something stood behind you. Only what not to do in the kitchen. Only what not to look at through the gaps. Only not to answer whispers. So I clung to the closest logic I had. If looking was dangerous in every other part of this cabin, it was dangerous now too. The breathing shifted slightly, angling closer. I felt it on my ear, a faint, icy brush that made my skin pebble instantly. My throat tightened until swallowing felt impossible. Then, it exhaled my name. Aaron, but not from its mouth, from behind its breathing, like something else was speaking through the shape behind me. Like whatever was there wasn't the thing making the sound. My stomach twisted violently. I forced myself not to respond. The breathing paused, like it was thinking. Then it stepped back. Not a full step, just a shift of weight. A withdrawal. Like something was considering a rule it didn't quite understand. Testing whether I would break it first. Seconds stretched, warped, became heavy. I needed to move, but moving meant risk. Staying still meant letting whatever stood behind me keep choosing the next moment. I wasn't about to surrender that kind of control. So slowly it felt like carving my body out of stone. I shifted my weight to one knee, then the other, inching sideways. As long as I didn't turn my head, as long as I didn't look over my shoulder, I could move. The breathing followed. No steps, no shuffle, just presence. Like it glided with me. My pulse slammed in my neck. The fire popped loudly. I flinched despite myself. The presence behind me leaned forward again, like my reaction interested it, like it registered fear as an invitation. I crawled toward the bed without lifting my head, lantern still on top of the blanket where I'd left it. The shadows under the frame throbbed with memory, the whispering, the shifting, the voice practicing my name. I wasn't sure if that thing was still under there, or if it had become the thing behind me, or if they were separate. I wasn't sure which possibility terrified me more. I reached the bed, grabbed the lantern with a shaking hand, and cautiously backed onto the mattress like someone climbing out of deep water. The breathing didn't follow me onto the bed. It stayed just outside the circle of lantern light, close, attentive, waiting. I didn't dare point the lantern its way. Even indirect light might count as looking. The last thing I needed was to find out what happened if I saw its shape too clearly. The cabin felt smaller by the second, shrinking in around me. The cold deepened. My breath formed faint condensation in the air. The warmth of the stove couldn't reach the corners anymore. I checked my phone again. 11:23 p.m. Barely halfway through the night if I was lucky. I doubted I would be. The presence didn't move. It didn't whisper. It didn't make any sound except that calm, predator-patient breathing. It knew I was trapped. It knew the rules better than I did. Or worse, maybe the rules existed because of it. My hands were trembling again. I pressed them together to stop the shaking. Minutes oozed by in slow, grinding increments. Then I heard something I hadn't expected. Footsteps outside. Light ones, human-sounding, crunching along the gravel path that curved around the cabin. I sat up straighter, breath held, listening. Another step, and another, closer. I didn't move, couldn't move. Then a faint, trembling voice filtered through the door. "Hello? Is someone inside?" My mouth went dry. The voice sounded young, maybe late 20s, early 30s. Breathless. Scared. I saw the cabin light. I've been lost for hours. My phone died. Please, I just need directions. A real person. A real hiker. A real human voice. The presence behind me went still in a new way, a predator scenting potential competition or opportunity. I whispered at the smallest volume possible, barely a breath. Don't answer. I didn't know if that man outside could hear through the door, but I hoped he couldn't. I wasn't talking to him anyway. I was talking to myself, because the rules were absolute. Do not respond. Not to knocking, not to voices, not to anything outside. Even if someone begged, even if they sounded human. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Please, the man said. His voice cracked. If someone's in there, answer me. The presence behind me leaned forward again, as if fascinated. I shut my eyes tight. The doorknob rattled. Once, twice, then violently. Hey! The voice snapped suddenly, completely different now. Sharper. Wrong. Aaron, open the door. My blood iced. He knew my name, and his tone wasn't lost anymore. The presence behind me inhaled slowly, savoring something. I clamped my teeth together and didn't move. Silence. Then the voice outside imitated the same eerie cadence I'd heard from under the bed earlier. My, Aaron. The knob stilled. A long, deliberate scrape dragged across the front door, like claws or bone or something worse. Then footsteps walked away, not toward the trees, around the cabin, toward the back wall, toward the gaps, toward where something else was already waiting. I didn't breathe. The cabin held its breath with me. And then, outside, just behind the thin wooden wall, something whispered, "What shape?" as if asking the thing inside what to become next. The question hung in the air like a breath that wouldn't exhale. What shape? Not from the thing outside. Not from the thing inside. Something in between, as if the two were exchanging information through the cabin wall, sharing a language made of breath and imitation. My heart thrashed so hard I thought it might shake the bed frame. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to disappear into it. The lantern beside me flickered weakly, its battery beginning to wane. The fire in the stove thinned into low, glowing coals. Everything that made the cabin feel safe was dimming. The breathing behind me shifted again. Not stepping, not moving, but altering. Like the act of deciding what shape to take involved rearranging its form without changing its position. I didn't look. I didn't even dare imagine. Outside, footsteps dragged around the cabin again, slow and cautious. Not the light steps of the man's voice. That was a thin disguise now, but something heavier mimicking the sound of walking. Too heavy, too evenly spaced, too perfect. Shape, shape. The whisper outside repeated the word, tasting it like syllables it shouldn't possess. The thing inside let out a slow exhale, as if answering without speaking. The presence at my back shifted once more. My pulse hammered so loudly I wondered if it could hear it, if that's what it was waiting for. Then, the outside voice spoke again, clearer this time. Which way did he look? I shot down my spine. It was asking. Inside the wall, directly behind me, something pressed lightly against the logs, the barest push as if pointing. Pointing at me. Outside, the voice made a soft, pleased sound that wasn't human at all. Something was communicating across the cabin walls. Collaborating. Coordinating. And I was the subject of their conversation. A fresh cold rolled through the cabin, deeper than before. The lantern's dim light shuddered in the chill. I pulled my knees up to my chest, curling around the shrinking warmth of the blanket, trying to think with a mind that wanted nothing except to scream. A soft tap touched the wall behind my head. Then a second, then a third. Rhythmic. Not knocking, not like before, but a message, a signal. The world tightened around that sound until everything else disappeared. I gripped the edge of the mattress, knuckles white, every muscle begging me to run. But run where? Outside, something waited that knew my name. Inside, something stood behind me that had breathed inches from my skin and spoken in a borrowed voice. All I could do was sit there, trapped, listening to the two of them tapping and whispering through the wood as if negotiating what would happen next. Minutes dragged by in agonizing silence. My phone read 12:17 a.m., barely halfway through the night. The tapping stopped suddenly. A long, slow scrape replaced it. Not under the bed this time, not at the door, but right behind me, tracing the outline of my spine through the wall. I bit down on a scream and tasted iron. The shape inside wasn't touching me, but it was letting me know exactly where I was, breathing like it could read my pulse. Then outside, the footsteps moved again. Around, closer, back toward the door. I heard something place its weight against the front steps. Slow, deliberate, familiar in a way I did not want it to be. Then, tap, 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 at the door. Soft, polite, the exact same pattern as earlier. I stayed still. I had to. Rule number 3 was absolute. Do not respond to knocking between sunset and sunrise. The thing outside tried again, louder. Tap, tap, tap. The presence inside inhaled sharply, excited, as if the knocking meant something to it. I felt its breath shift, felt the pressure of its awareness lean forward. The doorknob rattled violently, metal clanging. Open it, the voice outside hissed. Let me in, Aaron. Let me in. Inside, behind me, something uttered a soft, rasp sound. The closest thing to approval I'd ever heard from anything non-human. I stared at the lantern, its dimming glow shaking. The flame inside the stove guttered lower, shadows stretching across the room like reaching hands. They were working together. Outside, trying to lure me into breaking a rule. Inside, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Both knew exactly what would happen if I did. The doorknob rattled harder. Aaron, the voice outside said, softer, almost gentle. You already looked. There's no reason to follow the rules now. My stomach dropped. It knew. It knew I'd looked through the gaps earlier. It knew I'd broken rule number 4. But the rules didn't say what happened after breaking just one. They never said you had to be perfect. They never said the consequences triggered instantly. Maybe the rules weren't about avoiding danger entirely. Maybe they were about surviving long enough to leave before 10 a.m. I stayed frozen, breath shallow. The rattling stopped. Silence rolled through the cabin once more, thick, absolute. Then, in a voice so low it almost broke itself in half, you already belong to the dark. Let us in. The presence behind me leaned so close that the cold touched my back like a ghost hand. My mind scrambled for any thought, any rule, any way out. But all I could think was, if I made it until morning, would these things still be here? Would they get impatient? Would they get hungry? A faint laugh rasped from outside. Not human. Not pretending anymore. Then the footsteps moved away, drifting back around toward the rear of the cabin where the gaps were widest. As they left, the presence inside exhaled one word. Not to me, but to the thing outside. Soon, I didn't sleep. I didn't blink. I barely breathed. Morning felt impossibly far away, and the rules suddenly felt very, very incomplete. The word soon hung in the air long after the presence inside the cabin stopped speaking. I didn't dare shift my body or even adjust my posture. I sat rigid on the bed, every muscle coiled so tight they hurt, listening to the quiet throb of the forest outside. Except it wasn't the forest. Not anymore. Whatever natural world had surrounded me earlier had retreated fully, leaving the night hollow, like the cabin existed in a pocket of stillness carved out by something else. Outside, the footsteps stopped moving, not fading, not wandering, just stopping, stationary, waiting. Inside the cabin, the presence didn't move again, but I could sense it shifting its focus. The way an animal angles its attention toward the next sound, the next scent, the next heartbeat. I tried to calm mine, but fear has a way of making that impossible. My breath shook, quiet, too loud. I held it. The clock on my phone read 1:04 a.m., still hours before dawn. I needed to think. The rules existed for a reason. They were written crisp, tight, without ambiguity. Someone before me had survived long enough to write them, or had at least understood the patterns well enough to leave warnings. But the list, as terrifying as it was, did not include guidance for this exact moment. The dual presence, the communication between inside and outside, both knowing my name, both aware I'd broken rule number 4. I replayed the rules silently, like reciting a prayer from memory. Lock the door immediately. Don't open curtains or windows. Don't respond to knocking. Don't look through the gaps. Ignore anything in the kitchen. Check under the bed once. Don't answer whispers. Leave before 10 a.m. I'd broken one. I'd bent another. But maybe that didn't mean I was doomed. Not yet. The rule about leaving before 10 a.m. struck me differently now. It wasn't one of the early rules. It wasn't grouped with "don't do this at night." It was the last one, a deadline. A deadline meant the rules only mattered until then. A deadline meant something happened after that time. Something the writer knew you had to avoid. If I could hold out, if I could survive until then. A soft click echoed across the room. My head jerked up before I could stop myself. Came from the kitchen. Not a whisper, not a scrape. Something mechanical. The stove knob had turned by itself. Very slowly, just enough for the metal to click. There was no gas flowing, no flame lit, no possibility that this was natural. But the movement wasn't abrupt, it was careful, curious. The presence inside was trying things, testing the environment, testing me. Another click, this time right beside the first. The second knob turned a fraction of an inch on its own. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. Rule number 5 repeated in my head like a warning alarm. If you wake up and something is standing in the kitchen, leave it alone. I wasn't waking up, but maybe the rule didn't care about that distinction. Maybe leave it alone applied no matter what. The presence continued exploring the stove knobs, twisting them minutely one by one. They were too small to make big sounds, but each click hit my nerves like a pin. The outside footsteps resumed again, slower this time, circling the cabin, dragging lightly across the dirt. Not walking, tracing, outlining the building like a predator assessing a trap. My mind ran in circles. If either of these things got inside, if either broke a window, if either forced the door, the rules didn't say what happened then, which meant I didn't want to find out. I grabbed the lantern, hugging it against my chest to steady the flickering glow. His battery was fading. I'd brought 2 spares, both in my backpack, which sat on the chair near the door. The door near the presence. The door near the window curtains I wasn't allowed to open. I weighed my options. The lantern would die soon. The cabin would be dark. I didn't know if darkness changed anything's behavior. All I knew was this: if they wanted that darkness, I wouldn't let them have it. Moving slowly, I reached one arm across the bed and grabbed my jacket. I slid one hand into the pocket, curling my fingers around the small LED flashlight I'd tucked inside earlier. A backup light, not as bright as the lantern, but enough to see. Enough to keep shadows from overwhelming the room. Enough to stay sane. The stove knobs stopped clicking. Silence pressed in tight. Then, a faint inhalation behind me. The presence inside was shifting its attention again. Only this time, it wasn't shifting toward the kitchen, or the walls, or the door. It was shifting toward the bed, toward me. My lungs felt like they seized in mid-breath. I pressed my back hard against the wall, blanket clutched in my fists. One soft sound escaped the presence, a half-breath, half-utterance, something that carried a question in its tone. It whispered, "Turn." No, no, no. My pulse thundered. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I didn't meet the command. But then something horrifying happened. Outside, the voice that had been circling the cabin responded instantly, mimicking the inside one with perfect, hungry precision. "Turn." Both voices now, inside and out, repeating the same single word. "Turn, turn, turn." The pressure in the room swelled. The air thickened. My skin crawled with 1,000 needles of panic. They were trying to make me break a rule, trying to make me look. Maybe not through a gap this time. Maybe at them. Because maybe that was the final mistake they needed. I shut my eyes, gripping the lantern so hard my knuckles burned. "Turn." The command shook the cabin walls. The lantern flickered violently, then steadied. The presence behind me inhaled again, deeper, as if gathering something. Then everything stopped. No voices, no breathing, no footsteps, just silence. The kind of silence that feels like a blade pressed gently to your throat. And from somewhere very close, too close, the soft, cold whisper, "Morning won't save you." 2:16 a.m. 8 hours. 8 impossibly long hours. The flashlight beam trembled across my hands. Shadows licked the walls with slow, hungry movements, reacting to the dying lantern. The presence behind me remained upright, tall enough that its cold seemed to seep down the wall like condensation. The thing under the bed shuffled once, so lightly the floor barely registered the pressure. The one in the chair didn't move, but its posture shifted, the creak of an old wooden chair bending under new weight. And the presence outside lingered at the door, breath frosted against the tiny crack beneath it. All 4 of them waited. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. And that's when I noticed something I'd missed in my panic. The wood was warm. Not from the stove, the warmth was wrong, uneven, like something else had been touching it, leaning into it, learning its texture. I recoiled instinctively. The flashlight beam jerked upward, slicing the darkness in a quick arc. The presence behind me responded instantly. A sharp inhalation, a recoil, as if the light had grazed it even without direct contact. They hated the light. That much was clear. But I didn't have enough battery to blind them for long. The LED would dim in an hour, maybe less, and the lantern was almost done. The thing in the chair spoke first. Not with a question this time, not with imitation or curiosity, but with intention. "Aaron," it murmured. The voice had deepened, less mimicry, more identity. "When the light dies, open the door." Cold rush hit my spine. Behind me, the tall presence pressed closer to the wall, like it agreed. Outside, a soft, anticipatory scrape traced along the wood paneling. Under the bed, the thing there whispered a low, eager click of its tongue, like a child trying out a new sound. My pulse hammered in my ears. "No," I whispered again, involuntary, terrified. The cabin responded instantly, voices layering in eerie harmony. "No, no, no," mocking the word back at me, weaving it together like a rope. The air grew thicker, breathless, heavy with expectation. My only thought, my only chance, was to hold out until dawn, until whatever this place turned back into something human. The flashlight beam jittered as my hand shook. The lantern dimmed more, becoming little more than a dying ember in its plastic shell. I kept reciting the rules in my head, the only rules I had, the only lifeline. Don't open the door. Don't respond. Don't look. Don't interact. Leave before 10 a.m. But I wasn't going anywhere now. The presence behind me shifted again. A long, slow, deliberate slide of weight downward, as if lowering its head to my height. I felt the cold radiating through the wall inches from my skull. The chair creaked. The presence under the bed exhaled sharply. A warm, damp puff of air that touched my ankle. It had moved closer. I jerked my leg back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Every presence in the cabin responded at the same time. A sharp, synchronized inhale, like predators sensing movement. My breath hitched in my throat. Minutes dragged by in agonizing silence. I checked my phone again. 2:31 a.m. 15 minutes. 15 minutes felt like years. The outside presence finally broke the silence. Its voice pressed through the cracks in the door, not mimicking anymore, but speaking with something like authority. "Your rules are wrong, Aaron." A shiver ripped through me. The chair voice followed, calm and steady. "You misunderstand them." The presence behind me leaned closer, so close the cold stung my scalp. "They do not keep you safe." Pause. "They keep us interested." My heart clenched. The thing under the bed made a soft, delighted hum. I swallowed hard, throat dry. Then the one outside whispered, "Why do you think the last rule says leave before 10? Silence. A long, dreadful silence, until the presence behind me whispered, almost tender, "It is not for you." My blood iced. I didn't want to understand. I didn't want to follow the thought. But I did. The rules weren't meant to save guests. The rules were meant to give these things something to play with. Structure, routine, a ritual. The chair voice broke the silence with a single, quiet truth. No one leaves at 10. The lantern dimmed again. A thin, dying glow. The flashlight flickered. All four presences inhaled at once. Hungry, waiting. The chair creaked. The underbed presence scraped its nails lightly across the floorboards. The tall one behind me pressed closer. The outside voice whispered, "We're almost done learning." My stomach twisted. Light. I needed more light. Anything. My pack. The other batteries. They were on the chair beside the door. Beside the presence sitting in that chair. I stared into the dimming lantern glow, trying not to panic. I could make a run for it. Crawl low. Keep the flashlight aimed down. Grab the spare batteries. But the presence in the chair breathed softly. A slow, amused exhale that told me it already knew what I was thinking. The flashlight flickered again. My chest tightened painfully. No, 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 no. If the light went out, I was done. I stood up, too quickly, and the presence behind me flinched, withdrawing half an inch. They all reacted to sudden movement. Good. It wasn't much, but it was something. I stepped off the bed. Quiet, careful. The chair creaked again, a warning. The flashlight beam trembled across the floorboards as I inched closer to the door, to the pack, to the batteries. Cold air brushed the back of my neck as the tall presence leaned close again. The underbed thing hissed a quiet, eager breath. Outside, footsteps shifted in anticipation. One more foot forward. The chair presence spoke, voice soft and firm. "You don't want to do that." I froze. My pulse thundered so loud the flashlight shook. They were all waiting for me to slip, to look, to answer, to drop the light. Any mistake, any break in the chain. The flashlight flickered one last time, a faltering pulse. I tightened my grip, desperate. The outside voice whispered, "When the light dies, so do you." I stepped toward the chair anyway. The world held its breath. Then, the flashlight died,